You're listening to the Philly Young Adults Podcast.
It's sort of like we planned so long for this time together. I had been, as I shared with you all, looking forward to this time together. I thought 4 sessions, wow, that's 4 sessions of about 4 hours total, and really the time has flown by. I hope you've enjoyed being together about half as much as I have, which means you still really enjoyed it because I've really enjoyed my time with you all. But really, thanks. I look forward to staying in touch, hopefully with some of you. I'm easily sort of accessible. If you just Google my name, you'll get my website, you'll get all of my contact information. I do not have a secretary. I used to, his name was RJ, he quit. I'm not sure, in the back, there you go. But no, I do not, I answer all of my own correspondence. So if we don't get to some of your questions, or don't get to, or if something pops up in the future in your Bible study and you just want to run it by someone, especially if it's something that we talked about, I'd be happy to be a resource to you all, for you all, if I can. And as Pastor Brian was saying, in reality, I don't stand up before you all as an expert. I do have training, real specific training in certain areas, particularly language and the like. But I stand before you all as a brother. I too am doing my best to work through a lot of these difficult things. And I think that as we learn together, learn in community, we can hold each other accountable for our readings, our interpretations, and our applications of the biblical text. And that's what we do. We are mortals. We're all mere mortals. And we're all doing our best to work our way through some of these difficult texts. We're all doing it together. So hopefully I've been able to share some with you all and help you in the next step, in your next step in your own personal Bible study, but I can guarantee that the preparation for this has also helped me. So let's continue to stay in touch. But in the meantime, we have one more session, and hopefully this will be an asset to your personal study. A lot of this, as I said, not a lot of it, but portions of this comes specifically from the last chapter of my book on Proverbs called Proverbs Pathways to Wisdom, which talks about what to do when the Proverbs don't work. But I will also summarize other sections of the book and give some examples that I actually don't even give in the book as well. And then I'll certainly leave some time to go through questions. All of us like a good proverb that is indeed easily memorizable, a short adage that can get to a generally applicable truth, right? Let me give you some proverbs that you all are pretty familiar with. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Now, some of you are thinking, that's not a biblical proverb. Of course it's not a biblical proverb, because the Proverbs aren't only in the Bible, right? The biblical Proverbs are in the Bible, but there is a such thing as a proverb. And Proverbs are short adages that relate generally applicable truths. So the Proverbs that we see in the Bible are short adages that relate generally applicable truths. And we should read them like you would understand, abstinence makes the heart grow fonder. Now, why is that important? Because we all know that there are proverbs that contradict proverbs, right? So for example, abstinence makes the heart grow fonder is precisely how I would talk to a couple that was separated, engaged couple that was separated by thousands of miles. I would encourage them. And I would say, yes, you will get married in 3 months. But absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? You've heard that before. Now, let's say this couple that's separated by 3,000 miles or so ends up having a big fight in which the man dumps the woman or so. And the woman calls her friend up crying, or the man, it doesn't matter, and says, Johnny or Jane dumped me. And the friend comes alongside and wants to support and says, out of sight, out of mind. Is that a proverb? It is. It's a generally applicable truth, right? Out of sight, out of mind. That relates to the source of human perception. Generally speaking, if we're not looking at something, we're not thinking about that particular thing. If we're not intentionally looking at things, we generally don't tend to pay attention to them. That's precisely one of the principles that we talked about last night. If we're not reading the Old Testament, it's not going to be in our mind, right? It's not going to work its way to our heart. Out of sight, out of mind. That is another proverb. It's not a biblical proverb. It's another proverb. It's a short adage that has a generally applicable truth. Now let's read those two together. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Out of sight, out of mind. They contradict, don't they? One is saying, hey, if you intentionally or you're not able to see someone that you really care for, you're going to think about them more. Or you're going to think about that person more, right? The other one is saying, if you intentionally or unintentionally don't see someone, you're not going to think about them. You get that? But in their context, in the context that I just presented to you all, one where we have a couple that really loves each other, but they're far apart, absence makes the heart grow fonder, makes complete sense. It's true. In the other one, in which we have a couple that is broken, that has just gone through a nasty breakup, and one of the partners goes next to or calls their friend and says, "This just happened, Johnny. Jane dumped me." Out of sight, out of mind, makes complete sense. Sometimes we read the biblical proverbs not as generally applicable truths that have to fit into a context, but as promises that we strive to fit into our contexts. And that causes us problems as readers. Let's give another example that's, well, just blatantly, depending upon how you read, contradictory. I have Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5 are the first two verses that are up here. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Like, seriously? Just let's take line A from both of these verses. They're right next to each other. 4 comes just before 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly. Next verse. Answer a fool according to his folly. That's in the Bible. It's actually there. No translation issue here. You can look up all of your own translations. They're right next to each other. So we think to ourselves, hold on a second. The idea that there's something in the Bible that contradicts itself, that's one issue, okay? That's a theological issue. But we have to think, even if we accept like contradictions in the Bible, which we don't, and we're going to iron this out, but even if we do, was the writer really that dumb to put two contradictory statements right next to each other? We have to default to a position where we go, wait a second. The biblical writers were pretty smart. And no one intentionally contradicts themselves, especially immediately. That's not logical. That's not how people write. That's not even how people compile things. So let's just even say you were a compiler of a bunch of adages, short adages. It just wouldn't make sense to your readership to intentionally contradict yourself. So what's happening here, right? What is happening in this text? Well, let's sort of put our previous situation, or let's do what we did with our secular adages to this particular proverb here. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. When I was about, let's say, early 20s, mid-20s, I actually just started seminary. I had a friend that had become a very, very strict, he took a very strict theological position concerning the doctrine of salvation, okay? And he would contact all of his friends via Facebook to try to convince them of this theological position, and literally would stay up like through the night contacting, and I think it went into the hundreds of friends that was in our particular people group, trying to convince them of this theological position that wasn't essentially fundamental to the Christian faith. I think it serves us well to apply this particular proverb to Facebook. If we just start to think for a second about the types of people or the types of messages that we've seen on Facebook over the past month or so, not only trying to convince us that certain things are theological or not, but that a certain political position is correct on all sides, right? Imagine if you started answering all of that stuff. Some of you are looking at me like, what's the problem with that? Imagine if you tried to answer, particularly the things that are so far out, right? On Facebook, some of it's so far out. I think this first proverb applies here. Don't answer a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Imagine sitting at Facebook at 3 o'clock in the morning when you have to wake up for church the next day. You're serving on the worship team or you're good, whatever it might be. You're sitting at Facebook trying to tell someone, no, you should have voted this way because it's going to affect, the crop in North Dakota. Like, seriously, don't answer a fool according to his folly. You're going to end up being like that person. It applies there. Okay? Now, let's go back to my son in the cookie jar. My son steals cookies from the cookie jar. I approach him. I know he's done it. I have secret cameras all over my 700 square foot apartment. I say, did you steal a cookie from the cookie jar? And my son does. I start to talk to my son about not stealing and how theft is not something that honors God. And the second that I bring up God, he says, that whole God thing is stupid. Why do you spend all of your time in church talking to people about God? That's dumb. Stop wasting your time on that and stop wasting your time on me. Now, that is straight up folly. That's the definition of folly. Fool says in his heart, there is no God, right? That is the definition of folly. Yet, it is my responsibility, my inherent responsibility as a parent to answer that fool according to his folly. My responsibility is to come alongside my son, despite the fact that that's going to frustrate me, despite the fact that I'm going to cry with him. I need to answer him according to his folly. That's way different than the Facebook situation. You see that, right? Because if I don't come alongside my son, and I don't say to my son, you're wrong about this. You've seen change in our life, right? Let's go through the scriptures together. Let's take a deep breath. Let's work through this. Or if I don't do that, then he might fall into thinking that what he's doing and what he's thinking is completely fine. And it's fine to just obey God or disobey God and steal cookies and not care about it. And his heart could be calloused. So it's my responsibility as parent to answer him according to his folly. Now you see, supposedly contradictory statements are both completely right. Why is that? Because the Proverbs are principles based upon certain situations, just like the secular Proverbs. They're principles based upon certain situations. And sometimes when we run into problems with reading Proverbs, it's because we desire to apply Proverbs like they are promises. So here's a couple of things that we do, generally speaking, with the Proverbs. Number one, we I think probably improperly place ourselves in the position of, you ready for a big word? The interlocutor of the biblical Proverbs. So here's what we do. We read Proverbs and we're like, yes, Solomon is talking to me. And in actuality, Solomon is not directly, immediately talking to you. Solomon is talking to you, or the writer of different Proverbs are talking to you by way of application. But what we do, and it's easy to do this, is we read the text and they sound like commands, they sound like promises, and so we embrace them. So let's look at another very famous proverb, forgive me. They're both wisdom to a certain extent. Here we go. There we go. All right. Look at this one. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. So these are the types of Proverbs that we're particularly familiar with, that we memorize. By the way, continue to memorize them. Please, I'm not discouraging the memorization of Proverbs. I'm encouraging us to appropriate them well. Okay, so this is not intended to say stop memorizing the Proverbs. I recognize the Proverbs, because they are short adages and they're easily memorizable, they are a special section of Scripture in which people can memorize large portions. And I recommend that it's the Word of God, but we have to appropriate them well, and hopefully us reading like this together is going to help us in applying them. But Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 are really, some of the most famous Proverbs that we see. It's a section that's even longer that goes through verse 9. Trust the Lord with all of your heart and do not lean on your understanding. Okay, so it's very easy to read this proverb as if the writer is saying to you right now in Philadelphia, trust the Lord with all of your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. And to a certain extent, that's true. It is by way of application. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. Again, it's directed to the reader, the wise reader that's teachable by way of application. Sometimes when we read Proverbs, this is an easy one to apply, but if we read them exclusively as promises and us as the interlocutor, we will run into problems. We have to recognize that they're to be read as they're to be read as principles, and we are to apply them, not recognize them as promises. So, so give me an example of what you're talking about. How can we misread a proverb? I mean, after all, they sound like promises, and what's the distinction between sort of application and the promise, right? I mean, isn't the Bible written for us? Okay, yes. I just built the problem for you. Now look at Proverbs chapter 2, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. All right. Now, this is another very famous proverb. Many of us are familiar with this. In fact, some of you probably heard your parents mumble this under your breath when you were teenagers, or under their breath when you were teenagers, right? Like, a child is disobedient, you continue to train the child in the way that child should go, and this is the promise that parents sort of embrace. And in reality, this is not a promise in and of itself. If we perceive this as a promise directly given to us as interlocutors, in cases, these proverbs won't match up with our experiences. Because we know that there are people that have raised their children in the Lord in the church that have been great examples, never perfect, but their kids walk away, and unfortunately some never come back, and those parents sit in self-pity, not self-pity, sorry, they are not self-pity, man, that was a bad mistake. They are so upset because their children never come back. What's up? Is this a promise? Like what happened? What did I do wrong? This isn't a promise. How do we read these proverbs then? Well, we read these proverbs entirely. So as we read through the book of Proverbs, we see that the book of Proverbs was put together by a later hand, because there are several different writers that are mentioned, predominantly Solomon. It was put together by a later hand intentionally. The biblical authors, as we've been talking about since the first session last night, do things that are intentional, right? As we talked about in narrative and the like. With the Proverbs, it's the same way. Sometimes as we read the Proverbs, they don't feel intentionally. The book doesn't feel intentional because of how it's written, like there's about 900 of them just sort of scattered. But there is order. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 8 serve as an introduction. You can read and feel that the tone is a bit different in the introduction. The last part of chapter 1 through chapter 9 is a preface to these individual adages. They're not just short adages. If you notice, the short proverbs the majority of the short proverbs that we have memorized are actually between chapters 10 and 31, most of them between 10 and 30. Chapters 1 through 9, or the second half of chapter 1 all the way through chapter 9, is actually a repetitive poetic example of two different paths. There are two metaphors set out, and they are those two different paths are expressed actually through multiple metaphors. The one path is this pathway to righteousness, this pathway to wisdom, which is characterized by teachability. The preface calls people to be teachable, to be instructed. The wise person, by way of themselves, by being teachable, that wise person is already considered wise, and they're on the trajectory toward wisdom as they continue to follow essentially the instruction that is given from God, the wise instruction of the proverb that overlaps a lot as practical principles of the commands that we see instructed in the Torah. The other trajectory is this pathway to destruction. And on this pathway to destruction, we see several metaphors, but mostly, and several metaphors and really hyperboles concerning what happens on the person that goes to the pathway of destruction. And if you read through Proverbs 1 through 9, you're going to see that there's this cycle of metaphors relating to the pathway of wickedness or to destruction, and then the pathway to righteousness or wisdom. Destruction, wisdom, destruction, wisdom. And that happens several times in chapters 1 through 9. They're depicted through a couple of things. Initially, and most famously, we see these two pathways depicted by two different women. We see woman Folly, who is, for all intents and purposes, depicted as a prostitute, someone that tries to encourage people to come into her house and engage in illicit sexual activity. And then we see Lady Wisdom. They're not real figures. They're proverbial figures. They intend to symbolize two different pathways. Proverbs is not a narrative. Proverbs is not relating historical events. So we see those two pathways depicted by either loving and falling in love with wisdom and the woman wisdom, or being enticed by Lady Folly, who takes the person who is enticed to the pathway of destruction. Both of those ways are clearly understandable to everyone. So what I mean to get at is, in the Proverbs, we read that there's instruction from father to son a lot, father to son, and these depictions of women show up, and generally speaking, sometimes our inconsistent hermeneutic, we view the negative woman, the woman that strives to entice young men, as like a literal woman or something literal that men need to stay away from. But we have no problem viewing Lady Wisdom as some sort of metaphorical figure for the pathway of righteousness, and that's actually incorrect. They're both metaphorical figures that represent different ways, and they're intended for all readers, men, women, young, old, it doesn't matter, to recognize that the author is giving you two choices. You can either continue, or you can either be humble, teachable, and go to the pathway of wisdom represented by this woman wisdom, or you can be enticed by the desires of your own heart, and you can go down the pathway of destruction. And in this pathway of destruction, we see hyperbolic language about what's going to happen to that person, destruction, and they're going to fall into traps, and all of the things that were to their ultimate end is essentially going to be death. All of these really negative things. The reason why it's depicted that way is because the author is saying, please don't go down that way. You gotta go with Lady Wisdom. Look at how attractive that pathway is. But look at what happens if you choose folly. Be teachable. Be teachable. Now, once those two pathways are set out, chapter 10 changes a little bit. And we know that there's a change in chapter 10 because we see a preface to chapter 10 which says the Proverbs of Solomon. Chapter 10 verse 1 indicates that there's a break, and that's where you get these sort of short adages, right? Some of the stuff that we just read, 5 out of the 6 verses that we just read are from that particular section. And in that section, what we end up seeing is that there are pillar teachings to the Proverbs. They're not in order. As in, here is the section on riches, or here is the section on family, or that's not how they're written. They're compiled in such a way that you read a proverb and you move on, you read a proverb and you move on, you read a proverb and you move on, and you eventually learn how to apply the Proverbs in different circumstances. They all cannot fit all circumstances. But when we are in circumstances, the Proverbs can certainly apply to those particular circumstances. Now, the way to learn what the Proverbs is teaching about a particular issue is to take all of the Proverbs that touch on a specific issue and read them entirely, read them together. So, for example, the two Proverbs that seem to contradict each other here. Answer a fool according to folly. Oh, we'll go back up. Answer not a fool according to his folly. Answer a fool according to his folly. How should we use our mouth? That's one of the major principles of Proverbs. How should we use the tongue is a metonym for the mouth. How should we use our tongue? How should we use our mouth? These verses relate to how we should use our mouth, how we should use our words, right? In order to know what the Proverbs teaches about how to use our words, generally speaking, we can't just take one of those two. We have to read entirely. We have to read the book of Proverbs and see what the Proverbs teaches about different situations concerning how we use our tongue. And overall, we can get a teaching we can understand the teaching of Proverbs and the usage of language. I think that there are several of these major principles that stick out to us as we read the Proverbs entirely. For example, another one of them is the priority of the family in the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs talks repeatedly about prioritizing the family. Proverbs talks repeatedly about working hard. Proverbs talks repeatedly about how to manage riches. It's how when we read all of these Proverbs together, we're actually able to get a view of what the Proverbs teaches about a particular topic. But let's go back to the issue of the family. Another major issue that we see as it relates to how to understand the Proverbs that has caused really some difficulty, especially with my students, are these verses that talk about the rod of correction. Do not spare the rod and spoil the child is one of the major Proverbs. And the image that's given is that there is a physical rod, and parents are use the rod to hit their child or something like this, okay? Now, there are many different theories with regard to corporal discipline within the context of the church, and I actually am not going to talk about that. I actually am going to talk about how we read those verses. So those verses in and of themselves are not individual direct commands to you as interlocutors sitting here today. Those verses, read as a whole, emphasize the fact that there needs to be discipline and order within the context of the family. They're not commands to actually take a rod and take it. Now, I'm not actually commenting on that. But what we are saying is that, if we understand it as an actual command, then every time you spank your child, it has to be with a rod. Because that's what the proverb says, right? And you have to make sure you do it. That's the way to do it. Right? We actually don't read them that way. None of us intuitively read them that way. That's not how we read them that way. But as we read these types of commands together, what do we get? We get an overall idea as to what biblical wisdom teaches with regard to discipline within the context of the family. And not necessarily corporal discipline, but the family is prioritized and there is order within the family. That's very much in accordance with creation order. Now, for the last couple of minutes, I wanted to focus on one of the major issues that Proverbs touches on that has caused a lot of, I think we could say, internal strife. And that is the issue of just retribution. So for those of you not so familiar with that term, we believe that our God is just. And we read throughout the scriptures that our God rewards those that have faith in our God, but that God eventually, we read, especially in the New Testament, that there are consequences for those who do not trust in our God. We believe that our God is just and that there will be retribution ultimately. But the Proverbs seems to make it like just retribution is going to be something that we all see. That just retribution is going to be something that happens on this earth. All of us have had really bad things happen to us on the earth. I remember the first time I met Gabby, my wife. We met at the University of Puerto Rico in the year 2000, and we became friends in the residence hall, and I fell deeply, deeply, madly in love with her 20 years ago, and she ended up leaving Puerto Rico, and I was going to she's from Mexico, and so I went from Puerto Rico to Mexico to visit her, and I stayed in an apartment about an hour from where she was at doing a study abroad program for some time, just so that I could be close to her. So one time, Gabby and I were about to go dancing. I'm Baptist, but I dance with my wife. And we were we were just leaving the apartment that I was in, and we were going to go on a date. We were going to go dancing, and so I was dressed like, I was looking okay. And we went to go use a payphone outside of the apartment that I was staying at, and we actually needed to call her sister, and her sister was going to call us back with a telephone. A payphone is a big phone that you used to put money. Okay, so we didn't have cell phones. Literally, seriously, we didn't have cell phones. So so she needed to wait by the payphone. I think her sister was going to call back and give her some information that we needed. And we're standing there, and a guy comes up to me and he says, "Are you using the phone?" And I was like, "That's a weird question because payphones used to be back to back." Okay. So we were using one, and it was clear that the other one wasn't being used. And I'm thinking, like, what's the deal? Like, why is he asking me this? He pulls a big revolver out of his pants, and he shoves it in my face, and he says, "Give me everything that you have right now." And I'm like, this is happening? Like right now? And then I look over to Gabby, and the woman that I love, who I'm sure I'm going to marry, has another revolver pointed at her. Another guy was with her. We think, oh my gosh. And then, I gave him everything that I had. I had about $12. He stuck up the wrong dude that night, seriously. He had no idea. Like, I guess I was being deceptive like Rahab, I don't know. But he straight up, bad decision. But anyway, I gave him everything that I had. Gabby did. She had some bracelets and stuff. And then I remember how measured his voice was. He looked at me and he said, "Go and walk down the street, and if you turn around, I will kill you." And he was serious. I believed him. I think I probably should have believed him. So I grabbed Gabby's hand, and we followed the mugger's instructions. We went down the street. And, when that type of thing happens to you, and some of you have gone through probably some type of similar or traumatic experience, when that type of thing happens to you, and I'm glad none of us were physically hurt, but, it's not like the $12 is the only thing you lose, right? There's this dread of having a gun pointed at you and got someone saying they're going to kill you. You feel violated. You feel helpless. I remember looking at Gabby and having a gun pointed at her, and I couldn't do anything. And what can you do, right? You start to feel helpless. And that sentiment of just feeling helpless, and it turns into anger when you see loved ones shaken, and that turns into a desire to see retribution. And that is not unnatural. Our desire to see justice carried out is a very good thing. Biblical justice carried out is a very good thing. And sometimes as we read through the Proverbs, we think that we're actually going to see that happen all of the time, immediately. For example, Proverbs chapter 11, verse 21 says, "Be assured an evil person will not go unpunished, but the offspring of the righteous will be delivered." Proverbs chapter 11, verse 31 says, if the righteous is repaid on earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? It sounds like we're all going to be able to see just retribution happening on the earth if we believe that the Proverbs are promises and we are the interlocutors. That's where the problem ends up happening. If we perceive that these are promises to us, and our view of biblical justice is that God has to fulfill that promise that we see, then we will be disappointed. But if we recognize that the book of Proverbs was not intended to be read as such a way that you are immediately appropriate every single verse as a promise, not a principle, not by way of application, not based upon circumstances in which it applies, then we run into these problems. Now, here's the issue. We rarely actually see just retribution happening upon the earth. As human beings, we rarely see that type of justice happen, and that frustrates us as human beings. It's not uncommon for us to just think, is there justice? And the pithy statements of the Proverbs are not helpful if our attitude toward them is that they have to work for us. They become stumbling blocks for us because they don't do what we want them to do for us. And in actuality, our responsibility as readers is not to get the Proverbs to work for us, but to see what they are actually doing in the context for which they were intended, which takes a lot of work. It's easy for me to say to you, hey, look at this. Answer a fool according to his folly. Like if I have a situation with my son, I've presented a context in which that makes complete sense. But sometimes these don't make complete sense in our context. We don't get it. And when that happens, there are a few principles that relate to reading biblical wisdom literature that are very closely connected to the same things that we talked about last night. But more specifically, as it relates to wisdom literature, we have to admit our lack of knowledge. When we come across these proverbs that don't seem to work, we have to admit that we are simply not know-it-alls in the truest sense. We do not know everything. Another part of admitting that we do not know everything is simply recognizing that the Proverbs is one section of biblical wisdom that presents a broader, a more holistic. It's one section of biblical wisdom, but we get a broader, more holistic idea as to what wisdom says about a particular issue or a topic by reading all biblical wisdom. So, for example, we see these quick proverbs that talk about the comeuppance of the wicked in the book of Proverbs. You know, if you read the book of Job, which is also wisdom literature, it's amazing how much Job's friends sound like the Proverbs. They seem to be saying to Job, no, you're going to see. Well, first of all, they start off by saying, hey, Job, you know, you really should think about what's going on here, right, in the first round of speeches. They say, Job, you should really think about what's going on here because maybe there's some sin in your life or something like that, right? All of us know because the narrator in chapters 1 and 2 tells us that Job hasn't done anything deserving of that type of suffering. In fact, Job is suffering because there's a divine contest, right? This is not on Job. But Job's friends sound like the Proverbs, like, watch out, there might be something going on in your life. Job's friends' trite wisdom is not applicable in this situation, and the narrator tells us that. Then, by the time we get to the second round of speeches, Job's friends are saying, look at what's happening to you. You don't have kids. You don't have your riches. You're a wicked person. That sounds a little bit like the Proverbs, doesn't it? But in Job's case, the narrator tells us that does not apply. The narrator gives us specific information, specific circumstances in which quick, trite adages, they are trite in that situation, in Job's situation, they do not apply, even if they sound similar to the Proverbs. We have to admit that we admit our lack of knowledge. We have to admit that what we're looking at when we look at biblical wisdom is just one piece of the pizza. The pizza's an entire pie. And as we look at, you know what pizza is, right? As we look at the entire pizza, if we pull Job out, we can have Proverbs, we can have Ecclesiastes, we can have other biblical wisdom, but if we pull Job out, we're not going to see situations in which some of the adages actually don't apply, right? But if we put Job back and we pull out Proverbs, then we might think everything that sort of happens in this life is as a result of a divine contest. That God just sort of has willed and all of this sort of bad stuff to happen to me or even good stuff to happen to me, and there are no general principles to this. We read this all together, and we have to admit when we come to passages in biblical wisdom that we're kind of like, what is this? What's happening here? What's going on? We just don't know exactly what's going on all of the time in all circumstances, and our knowledge is limited even within the context of biblical wisdom. The second thing when we come to the issue of just retribution, especially in the Proverbs, but in biblical wisdom in general, the second thing that we have to do is we have to make sure as we read through these passages that we check the motives of our own heart. And I think that's very, very helpful, okay? Because sometimes our desire for just retribution, my desire for the police to come and arrest the people that had assaulted my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and myself, was a very good desire, but sometimes our desire for just retribution can turn into a desire for not just personal justice, but also a vindictive desire to see people suffer. See people suffer that we don't agree with. See people suffer who we think are wrong. See people suffer who have different morals than we do. It can very quickly turn into a desire to simply see people suffer the wrath of God because they do not agree with us. We have to check our hearts. We have to make sure that that doesn't slip in there as we say, oh God, be just, like bring about just retribution. We're not actually saying, God, make people suffer. In fact, that's not the heart of God. The heart of God is that even if people are doing wrong, that they would turn to him in repentance and that he would forgive them, and that in actuality, they wouldn't suffer the ultimate consequences of their sin. And the reason why we should not be so vindictive is because we've turned to God and we're not suffering the ultimate consequences of our own sin. So we have to make sure when it comes to just retribution that we're not just wishing people suffered. The third thing, and I think this is probably the most important, and this is where we will end. Brian, if you're ready for some questions, we can do this. And this is the most important for the entire conference. When we don't understand biblical wisdom and generally applicable everything in the biblical text, when we don't understand, here's what we do. We reread it, and we reread it, and we reread it. Not dissimilar to what Pastor Brian was saying earlier, we recognize that as we go through again and again and again, that God, by the power of his Holy Spirit, can teach us. He gives us new faculties. He permits us to be able to be learners in unique ways, not only to acquire more and more information, but to apply that information to our lives. And so when we don't understand what God is doing in a text, we don't give up on a text. We default to reading that text with a hermeneutic of trust as opposed to a hermeneutic of suspicion, recognizing that as we continue to read over and over and over again, that God desires to communicate verbally to his people, and we trust that he will give us the ability to understand exactly what we need to understand.
This has been great. Thank you, man. Yeah. And I think that you have, one of the things that Dr. Hernandez has done is to give you a taste to let you know that there is a lot more. You can press into deeper understanding and a deeper knowing of God in the Old Testament, right? If nothing else, like he has just sort of set out some things before us that should entice us to say, it's worth pressing on. You guys feel that? Even if you didn't catch everything, it's the kind of stuff that you're like, oh, that's all there, and I can go get it. I can spend my life going to get it all. And again, the Old Testament can become not a foreign country, but like my old neighborhood with all my family, right? Which is exactly how the Bible talks about the people of God, right? We are going to spend some time worshiping, but there's plenty of time. Do any of you have specific questions about wisdom literature in particular that you just, if we want to take 5 or 10 minutes for questions that you want to ask, and then you'll be here for a few minutes afterwards too for individual questions, yeah, which is pretty cool too. So if you don't, it's fine, but since we do have a minute, I just want to raise your hand. Something about Proverbs or one of the Proverbs that Dominic was talking about. If not, that's fine. We're not going to stand here and
they're warming up.
Create emotional pressure.
Yes, what's your name, brother? Benny.
Vinny. What is he like? What's your favorite part of the Old Testament?
What's my favorite part of the Old Testament? If I tell you I have a favorite part, then I'll sort of be doing this super canon.
No, you won't. You're just telling us about yourself, not about the Bible.
Be a little bit of a hypocrite here, but Vinny, thank you for the question. I go back and forth between my favorite part of the Old Testament between Esther and Ruth.
Look at that. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. The question is why. Until last week, I was considering calling Pastor Brian and asking him if we could just do 4 sessions on the book of Esther or Ruth. I did not. I stuck with the original plan. But I love these books, Esther and Ruth. I think, and if you see, those books are written as purely awesome literature. And I think we as readers of the Bible, we believe that God has revealed himself through words. I'm repeating a little bit, but here's the thing. We concede that, but sometimes we think that if we treat the Bible as good literature, that we're just treating it like any other book. And in reality, the Bible deserves to be treated like any other book and more. So if you pick up any other book, you're gonna default to reading any other book like we defaulted to understanding some of the Proverbs that I read earlier. You're like, oh, that's cute. That's like a proverb. That's an adage. It's generally applicable. But when we get to the book of Proverbs, our reading changes. We're kind of like, it's the Bible. We're the interlocutor, right? I think that if we read Ruth and Esther and pay close attention to what's going on, we can really appreciate these books as great literature. And here's the thing, they both feature, especially Ruth, underdogs. And I'm 5'8", and I'm a bit of an underdog, but I do very much appreciate the themes there. I think I'll just say this very briefly about the book of Esther. Esther is very helpful for understanding what eventually became the intertestamental period. It's very helpful to understand what eventually became the Purim holiday. And it's a book that is written in exile without the name of God or the title of God being mentioned. And so what we have is a lot of gapping there. We're not given a lot of information. And so the reader is encouraged to be a very good reader to try to pick up what's going on there, because clearly, as it is in our scriptures, we have to continue to follow the line of redemption, and it forces us to read well. Because there is no comment in the book of Esther that says, so God did this, so that. Nothing like that. The name or the title of God, neither one of those are mentioned. So we're forced to be good readers. I really like that, yeah.
There you go.
Thank you very much. The question relates to what benefit does original language study have to do? Look, you got what's your name, brother? Garrison. Okay. Garrison, there is like no academic elitism here. Not everybody's going to be able to study original languages, and I recognize that. But people do, because there is indeed a benefit. So let me just start off by saying, I don't think everybody's going to do this, and I don't think everyone has to do this, but some of us are given the privilege of doing it, and when we do it, we recognize that there is great benefit to it, okay? So let's just start off with some of these benefits. I think, just going to try to be brief here, number one benefit relates to reading deliberately. So when you learn biblical languages, you have to slow down. And when you slow down, you start to pay attention to nuances. And it's in the nuances of the biblical text that sometimes the author is really teaching. So I think learning biblical languages really helps someone that has a tendency to love the Bible. You love the Bible, you read the whole thing, but you have to slow down. And when you slow down, you're able to realize in many cases, you're able to finally realize what might actually be going on in some of the texts. I think there are other things that are beneficial, but I think that's the number one thing that relates directly to Christian reading and life.
Garrison, I have a copy of the Basics of Biblical Hebrew curriculum in my office if you want it. All right, cool.
For everyone. He has a copy for everyone.
No, just for Garrison.
No, for everyone.
He's the favorite.
I think I saw, was there one other one over here? Maybe not. Garrison asked the last one. Awesome question.
Dr. Dominic Hernandez, he's a teacher at Southern Seminary.
What's your name? Jessica, awesome question. The question is, is there someone or a resource that I could recommend to sort of further assist in the reading and the study of the Old Testament? Jessica, I actually am writing a book that is going to focus on hermeneutics and the Old Testament. It's due in January. Pray for me. It might not get done. It's going to probably come out next year, so not quite yet. In the meantime, some of what I did is not necessarily Old Testament study per se, but it's the people that I read for these types of studies, they're not commentators and the like. They're more people that focus on how to read texts well, and those are sort of hermeneutics books, that's reading, the art of reading and things like that. There is a good, not even simple, it's not simple, but it's not super advanced hermeneutics book that I recommend by one of my colleagues named Rob Plummer, and it's called 40 Questions to Reading and Interpreting the Bible. I think it's published by Creed.
Plummer, Plummer?
Plummer. Yeah, that's a really good book, probably only about 300 pages. Say that title again? Excuse me?
Say the title again.
I think it's called 40 Questions to Reading and Interpreting the Bible. I use it for my hermeneutics class that I teach. Okay, so what that's going to be is it's going to be more broad than Old Testament, but it's going to cover issues in the Old Testament. It's going to cover issues of genre. It's going to cover some of the inspiration stuff that we talked about as well. It's about 300 pages, but since it has 40 questions, it has like 7 pages of questions. So you're getting good enough information, some more resources and footnotes, but it's not going to be overwhelming as far as like getting into a lot of nitty gritty. But it's not really a beginner book either. It's good. It's really good, as far as I think this level, right? And we have a shy hand here. Are we done?
You want to do two more questions?
Sure. Did what I experienced in Mexico challenge my faith? Like as in not believing in God so much? No, I wouldn't say it challenged my faith in that sense. I mean, I think if that's bad stuff really happens to me, and that might not be the worst thing that eventually ends up happening to me. And that might happen again to me. So no, I don't think it really challenged my faith so much. That stuff, that stuff can happen anywhere, right? It can happen in the parking lot here. It can happen. So no, and it can happen to anyone. I'm sure there's a couple of people, at least in here, that have experienced something like that. Sometimes you're the person. I wish I had a more profound answer. It never challenged my faith in that sense, Yeah.
It's a good question, though. If you want to talk more about that, let me know. Yeah.
Should it have, in your opinion? No, that wasn't sarcasm. They giggled, right? I'm like here, dead, like straight face. Maybe I'm a fool. That's cool. Fool says in his heart there is no God. Whatever.
Yeah, totally. I think everyone knew what you meant, man. It can rock you. You can hit something in your life and it can rock you, right? Yeah. But I like hearing people that go, no, it didn't rock me. Doesn't that at least give you some confidence that it doesn't, right? Do you guys feel that?
Something else might.
That's cool.
You know what I mean? And I don't know what it would be. But something else might happen today or tomorrow and I might have that type of experience. That wasn't my response. My response was like, man, these guys are idiots. That was my response. It wasn't like a real sort of, the response was, I want these people found and put in jail so they don't ever do it, first and foremost, to me again and others. That was more my response. That's kind of where I went. So, yeah, I wish I had something more sort of spiritual to say with regard to that, but I think the Proverbs are they're really very practical principles based upon implementing what we see in the Mosaic Law. They're based upon the Mosaic Law, right? And so, I think that my visceral response, man, I hope these guys get locked up. Man, I can't believe, that's crazy. That's terrible. That was more of my response. It wasn't so spiritual. I know that this is the world in which we live, and sometimes that stuff happens. It's unfortunate, but